Have you ever felt trapped in an unwinnable situation? Stuck between bad options, unable to see a faithful or a positive path forward? Maybe a power struggle between parent and child feels unwinnable, and the only option seems to be ever-increasing conflict and consequences. Perhaps an old disagreement between spouses keeps rearing its ugly head, and the only option seems to be louder and louder arguments, more proof that I am right, and why won't they listen? Maybe a country has age-old political differences, and the only option seems to be more division, more aggressive partisanship, demonizing people who vote differently than we do. What sticky situation comes to mind in your life? Today's story from Isaiah and also the story from Matthew show two mazes with no exit, both connected by God's promise of presence, Emmanuel, God with us. For Isaiah, we have a problem in the kingdom of Judah. King Ahaz faces Assyria, that daunting enemy that enforces massive taxes with military might. The beginning of Isaiah 7 tells us that we are in the middle of the Syro-Ephraimite conflict of 734 BC, when the two kings of Israel, Ephraim and Aram, tried to conquer Jerusalem and replace King Ahaz with a puppet ruler that would support their coalition against Assyria. Archaeologists have also discovered carved stone panels and non-biblical letters that tell of this war. Assyria had just dominated the city of Lachish. Lachish had sent word to Jerusalem begging for military aid that never came, and Assyria's troops could march the 18 miles to Jerusalem in a week. It's about as far as Kennesaw Mountain was from Atlanta during the Battle of Atlanta. It seems the only way out of this trap is to fight a bloody war, somehow surviving a siege when other Jewish cities have fallen to Assyria. And so walking right into this storm, God sends Isaiah to King Ahaz to promise divine protection. Ahaz doesn't even dare to hope. He knows what Assyria does to cities under siege. It's brutal. He has reason to believe that the Assyrian army will be marching toward Jerusalem soon. They could get there in 5, 6, 7 days. He has lost all hope. For Joseph, the problem is that Mary is pregnant, and it's far too soon for that in their relationship. They aren't even married yet. The child is not his. And so the only solution he can think of is to break off his engagement. And the only question he has on his mind is which way to do that: the public way, which could lead to violence, or the quiet way, which would still leave Mary abandoned and in shame. If we think about the sticky pickles that Ahaz and Joseph find themselves stuck in, the current imagination, the assumptions of the world, present them both with terrible options. King Ahaz does not want to keep fighting wars. He knows Assyria will probably win, that it will be a harsh and brutal end for Judah, just like it was up the road in Lachish. Joseph doesn't want to abandon Mary. It doesn't really matter how he dismisses her, publicly or privately. It's an honor-shame society, and so either option leaves her on the street, viewed as damaged goods, unlikely to be able to marry again, probably condemned to a life of poverty if she survives. We don't hear from her in Matthew's gospel, but the Luke narrative tells of Mary's incredible strength and faith and courage. I believe that Joseph and Mary loved each other and that they wanted a life together. How would you feel if you were in their sandals? I would be scared and anxious and overthinking every possible action, having a hard time sleeping. Have you ever felt stuck in a trap disguised as a choice? Maybe you felt like you had two terrible options in front of you. Neither one could be ethically justified. Or maybe you find yourself trying to rationalize bad actions where the ends justify the means. Or you feel frozen because a path hasn't made itself known. Or you and a loved one are stuck in circular conversations that predictably lead to the same end, which is sore feelings and pain and a lack of resolution. Isaiah and Joseph's story each offer a glimpse of prophetic hope, which is the promise of hope that seems impossible until it's done. That's exactly what Nelson Mandela said, reflecting on his 27 years in prison and the long march toward freedom in South Africa. He said, "It seems impossible until it's done." Isaiah and Joseph both refuse to accept the premises of the world's terrible choices because they hear an inspired word from God and they choose to trust it. God's kingdom functions with a very different set of rules, principles, and priorities. Then as now, a living God calls us to participate in the work God is already doing, to flip scripts, to shift paradigms, and to build a different world, to expand the imagination of what we as a people think is possible. What would it look like to opt out of the nightmare that is the world's reality sometimes, and to trust instead in God's dream for the world, which is a just and secure future for all people? Isaiah promises that God will be with us, Emmanuel, and that God will protect Judah, that there is no need to fight the terrible war. The third option, which wasn't readily available to Ahaz, was to opt out of the system, not to fight the war. Isaiah points to a young pregnant woman, promising that by the time her baby can eat soft cheese, which I'm not a parent, but I'm going to guess that's, 1 or 2, pretty little, right? That's not very long. The threat from Assyria will have passed. And as the story goes, that is what happened. Judah survived Assyria's siege of that era. Although Babylon would conquer Jerusalem a few hundred years later, the dream of impossible hope lived so strong in the hearts of Isaiah's listeners that they remembered that story, and they told it over and over again, even when they had to live in exile a few hundred years after the telling of today's story from Isaiah. And you know what became the strongest symbol of impossible hope? A baby named Emmanuel, promising that God is with us in and through all things. So that story is so strong in the cultural memory that it lives for the gospel writers that are telling the story of Jesus. So then almost 700 years after Isaiah's writing, God tells Joseph in a dream that the Holy Spirit brings this child to their family, and Joseph does not need to leave Mary. Actually, he is still to marry her and to raise a family together. And that promise to Isaiah rings in everyone's ears. That's how they know to trust that story. It is exhilarating to go along for the ride in God's kingdom. By opting not to fight the war, King Ahaz avoids a bloody war. And in another Advent text close to today's reading, Isaiah's absurd vision of the peaceable kingdom, complete with vegan lions and snake-handling babies, puts impossible hope on poetic display. You know it. The leopard shall lie down with the lamb. It's the Christmas miracle. When Joseph trusts God and opts not to abandon Mary, the whole family accepts their incredible role in God's story. And you can see that in Joseph's justice, which includes compassion, he's neither pursuing his entitlement nor simple compliance with rules. But there's something in it of divine justice, which involves mercy, not merely enforcement of the logic of action and reaction. Jesus' arrival is also a sign of that kind of saving justice. Have you ever felt stuck between two bad options? Is there a world in which challenging the underlying assumptions frees you to trust in God's dream for the world in a way that tunnels out of the trap you thought you were stuck in, that expands together our cultural imagination of what is right and good and possible? Think of the march from Selma to Montgomery for voting rights in 1965. Earlier in that year, Martin Luther King Jr. met with President Johnson and heard that though the president was with him, that voting rights were not the top priority, and so he and others were going to have to wait. They didn't. They went instead to Selma, where Alabama Governor George Wallace was determined to block the march from beginning. Martin Luther King had wanted to delay it a little bit to spend some time with his family, but after a phone call with Atlanta hero Andy Young, they decided to let the march go on as planned, and then King would join a few days later. So that bloody Sunday, March 7th, state troopers attacked and badly injured about 600 protesters, including our former representative John Lewis, as they tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And if you think about it, the marchers might have thought there were only two good options. One was to step down, admit defeat. Another one might have been to meet violence with violence, to riot or in some way fight back. They appeared to be defeated. The power of the state seemed too great, but that's not what happened. That police brutality was captured in video and film. The marchers had harnessed what King called soul force, moral credibility, an appeal to our better angels. And they caught the imagination of the nation and the world. And then 2 days later, on March 9th, thousands more joined for a second attempt. Remember, only 600 were there on that Sunday, March 7th. And they crossed the Pettus Bridge again, but this time, state troopers were still poised to attack, and King was with the march. And instead of going across the bridge, he led the gathering in silent, kneeling prayer, partway across the bridge. A judge had issued a temporary injunction against marches, and so King wanted to draw attention to the injunction without breaking it completely. He and so many others shifted the paradigm. They refused to accept the premises they were presented with. They called the country to imagine a new reality. They trusted in God's alternative vision for the world, and they participated in this impossible hope. That demonstration in Selma dominated the national news. It changed the conversation. So much so that President Johnson addressed Congress on March 15th, a week later, calling for the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And then on March 21st, thousands more began the march from Selma to Montgomery, this time escorted by the National Guard across the Pettus Bridge and on for the next 54 miles, walking about 6 miles a day. And by the time they landed on the steps of the Alabama State Capitol in Montgomery, 25,000 people had gathered in peaceful, nonviolent protest. Then the Voting Rights Act passed with massive bipartisan majorities, 77-19 in the Senate, 333-85 in the House, signed into law on August 6, 1965. Can you imagine, in our day, 60 years later, moral leadership of that stature leading to that massive of a policy shift in 6 months? But that's what happened, with this city leading the national charge. King and his leadership team refused to accept the premise that the world was presenting them. They could have battled George Wallace and the segregationists with more violence and bloodshed, but they believed in their core that the living God, Emmanuel, was with them, had work for them to do, and would guide their feet, guide their actions in love. They prayed, they dreamed, they trusted, and they walked. They didn't assume that it would all be without incident. It was not. Or that everyone would make it to the promised land. They did not. But they believed that God would help them to make a way out of no way. And so don't ever let anyone tell you that the ways of this old world have to keep on having their say. Isaiah and Mary and Joseph and Dr. King and so many more chose to believe in an impossible hope, a prophetic hope, a hope embodied in a child, Emmanuel, God with us, here, now. Amen.